You listen to me very carefully. If you do not comply with my orders immediately, you are going to regret it. Do you understand me?
Before we start the story, tell me, where are you watching from? And if these stories speak to you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. They said the courthouse was a place where truth lived, but that morning it felt more like a stage where fear had the microphone. The heat was rising off the pavement, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes tempers short. 17-year-old Aaliyah Reed clutched a brown folder tight to her chest, the kind of careful hold you give to something that could change your whole future. She wasn't there for trouble. She was there because her mother worked behind those stone columns. Judge Naomi Reed, the woman whose name made lawyers check their notes twice before stepping into her courtroom. Aaliyah waited by the side gate, earbuds in, counting down minutes until her mom finished a hearing. Then a voice sliced through the noise. "Hey, you can't stand there." It wasn't a request. It was that sharp command that always comes before judgment. 3 officers in pressed uniforms stood by the gate, white faces squinting at her like she was a smudge on their morning shift. She tugged one earbud out and said softly, "I'm just waiting for my mom." The tallest one, broad shoulders, eyes that smiled like threats, took a slow step forward. "Your mom works here?" he said, a chuckle hiding under the question. When she nodded, he tilted his head. "Sure she does." Then came the line that would later headline every news broadcast. "Shut up, kid." 2 words. They sounded small, but they landed heavy. An entire history packed into one smear. The other officer shifted, not surprised, not shocked, just comfortable. It was routine for them. The gate buzzed closed behind her, and the street noise faded until it was just their boots on concrete and the hum of fluorescent lights. You could see her trying to decide whether to argue or walk away. That tight-chested hesitation every black teenager knows when authority suddenly turns hostile. The folder trembled in her hand, and with it the future inside. College applications, transcripts, the scholarship essay she'd rewritten 5 times. One of the officers circled behind her, pretending to check the security cone. The air changed, like right before a thunderstorm, except this storm was made of badges. "I said move along," the tall one barked, stepping too close. Aaliyah's voice stayed level, almost apologetic. "Sir, I'm waiting for Judge Reed." The name hit them, but not the way she expected. He smirked. "You rehearsed that pretty good." That's the part that always gets people. The disbelief that someone like her could belong to someone powerful. A few passers-by slowed, sensing tension but not yet sure if it was safe to care. Phones didn't come out right away. Folks still think maybe if they stay quiet, the world will fix itself. Inside the courthouse lobby, the clerk monitoring the security feed frowned. Camera 7, the one facing the side gate, flickered for a second, then went gray. It was just long enough for anything to happen out there. She tapped the monitor, cursed under her breath, and made a note to report it later. Routine glitch, she told herself, even though her stomach said otherwise. Back outside, Aaliyah took a half step back, bumping into the wall. She wasn't scared yet, just aware of tone, distance, posture. She'd seen enough news to know how fast routine can turn into incident. The officer leaned in, voice low enough that only she could hear. "People like you ought to know better than to hang around where you don't belong." He said it like a rule that had always existed. That's how racism usually shows up. Not shouting, just certainty. She opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off with that same smug phrase, "Didn't I tell you to shut up?" That's when someone across the street finally raised a phone. The screen light blinked red, catching reflections of blue uniforms and brown skin under morning sun. It was the kind of clip that starts quiet, almost boring, until later when the whole country can't stop replaying it. Inside, a clerk hustled toward Judge Reed's courtroom, whispering something about an issue at the gate. Nobody yet understood how deep that issue was about to cut. The judge was finishing closing remarks on a civil rights case. Irony, so thick it might have been scripted by fate. When her phone buzzed with a text from security, reading gate disturbance, possible minor detained, she frowned, but kept her tone steady, adjourned court, and stepped off the bench. Outside, the sound of raised voices echoed through the marble halls. The same officers who carried confidence like armor were now drawing the kind of attention they couldn't control. From a distance, it looked ordinary, an argument near the gate. Up close, it felt different. The imbalance so visible you could taste it. That's how racism hides in plain sight. It dresses as procedure. And for one long moment, the courthouse that preached equality became the scene that proved how little that word still meant. When the first raindrop from the lingering morning drizzle hit Aaliyah's cheek, it wasn't just weather. It was punctuation. The day had started gray and ordinary, but it was about to stain every uniform involved, and none of them, not the officers, not the bystanders, not even Aaliyah, knew that the woman walking down those marble steps toward the gate was the one person they should never have crossed. Humiliation doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it slides in quiet, wrapped in authority. The crowd at the courthouse gate had started to thicken, not because anyone wanted drama, but because something about the scene felt wrong. Aaliyah stood pinned between uniforms and concrete, her folder now on the ground, papers scattered like fallen leaves. Nobody had touched her. Not yet. But the way the officers stood, too close, too confident, made it feel like contact had already happened. Their words carried weight heavier than hands. "You think name-dropping a judge scares me?" the tall one said, voice thick with sarcasm. The other two smirked, feeding off the power imbalance that hung in the humid air. The city bus hissed to a stop across the street, and every head inside turned toward the sound of that tone, the one every black parent teaches their child to avoid. Aaliyah tried to pick up her papers, but one of the officers stepped on the corner of a page, pinning it to the concrete. He didn't have to say a word. The gesture said everything. She froze, the message clear. "You don't move until we let you." Phones were out now, recording at waist level. People wanted proof, but also distance. That's how modern courage works. Half hope, half caution. Aaliyah looked up, jaw tight, eyes wet but defiant. She didn't cry. She just swallowed the lump that came from being treated like a threat when all she'd done was exist in the wrong space with the wrong color. The officer with the radio pretended to check in, mumbling codes that sounded official but meant nothing. The static filled the silence, a perfect soundtrack for public embarrassment. "Next time," the tall one said, "wait on the other side of the fence. Easier for everyone." His voice dropped on that last word, heavy with meaning. Everyone knew what everyone meant. Inside, the clerk still wrestled with the camera feed. The screen kept flickering, gray static cutting through the image like censorship. She called the security office, but no one picked up. System update. A message finally blinked. She didn't buy it. Years of routine had taught her the difference between glitch and interference. She pulled out her phone, filmed the monitor, whispering, "Something's wrong." Back at the gate, the tension finally cracked the barrier of silence. A man in a suit called out from the sidewalk, "She's not doing anything wrong." His voice trembled, more nervous than brave. The officers turned, just enough to make him shrink back. That's the trick. They don't have to raise a hand. All they need is posture. Fear does the rest. The crowd fell quiet again. Aaliyah bent to gather her folder, fingers shaking. The officer who'd stepped on her paper lifted his boots slowly, leaving a dark soul print across her scholarship form. The camera phone zoomed in on that image, mud on opportunity, authority on innocence. Then, like an echo of irony, the courthouse clock struck 11. The sound rolled across the plaza, deep and ceremonial, a reminder that justice was supposed to live here. Aaliyah stood up, dusted her knees, and said softly, "I didn't do anything." It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact that no one in uniform seemed interested in hearing. The tall officer laughed once, sharp and quick. "Then you'll fit right in with the rest of the crowd inside." The words hit harder than any shove could have. The nearby officers chuckled, the kind of humor that tastes of bitterness and control. A gust of wind caught the edge of her folder, flipping a page open, one bearing the letterhead of Judge Naomi Reed. The sunlight caught the embossed seal, and one of the officers noticed, frowning. He leaned in, squinting. "Judge Reed? You related to her?" Aaliyah met his eyes. "She's my mother." The small answer rearranged the air. The laughter died, replaced by the sound of shoes shifting uneasily. For a heartbeat, even the breeze paused. "You messin' with us?" the tall one asked, but the confidence in his tone had cracked. The crowd started whispering, connecting the name to the woman whose rulings had dismantled more than one corrupt precinct. The whispers turned to murmurs. "That's the judge's daughter." "No way." Man, they done messed up. Inside, Naomi Reed's assistant burst into the courtroom doors just as the judge was stepping down. "Ma'am, there's a problem at the north gate," she said, voice too high to be normal. The judge's brow tightened. She'd heard that tremor before, fear disguised as professionalism. She gathered her robe, her steps fast and precise. Outside, her daughter stood still, waiting for dignity to catch up. A new voice broke through the noise, a passerby filming on her phone. "Smile for the camera, officers! That's Judge Reed's daughter you harassing!" The words carried like a flare. The officers froze, that familiar realization creeping up. This wasn't routine anymore. This was evidence. One of them reached for the radio again, muttering something about situation escalating. But it was too late. The story had already left the courtyard. The crowd began to talk louder, courage growing in the safety of numbers. Aaliyah took a slow breath, straightened her spine, and faced the tallest officer. Her voice was steady now. "I told you who I was." He said nothing. Silence. The only surrender pride can manage. Through the open courthouse doors, the first glimpse of black robes appeared. Judge Naomi Reed was walking toward them, every step echoing off the marble floor like a countdown. The tall officer tried to look busy, turning to his partners, pretending to check IDs that didn't exist. The crowd parted without being told to, instinct recognizing authority that didn't need to shout. The officer's confidence leaked away one blink at a time. Humiliation changed sides that day. It started with a girl at the gate and ended with men in uniform realizing how small their power looked under sunlight and camera lenses. The air buzzed with whispers, clicks of recording phones, the hum of justice waking up. And as Judge Reed stepped closer, the same crowd that had stayed silent minutes ago now waited, breath held, to watch what accountability looked like when it wore heels and carried a gavel. Inside the courthouse, people felt the shift before they knew why. It was that strange quiet that settles over a place built for order when something outside starts shaking it. Judge Naomi Reed was halfway down the hall when she heard the echo of her own name carried through the crowd outside. First a whisper, then a ripple. Her assistant jogged beside her, breathless, trying to explain and failing. "They stopped someone, your daughter, at the gate." Naomi didn't answer. She just quickened her pace, heels striking marble like a metronome for trouble. By the time she reached the front doors, the air tasted of cameras, tension, and embarrassment. She could see through the glass wall, the circle of uniforms, the girl against the fence, the crowd holding up their phones. Every instinct told her to stay calm, but the mother in her shoved the judge aside. She stepped outside, robe catching the breeze, voice low but sharp enough to cut. "What's happening here?" The officers turned. The tall one's smirk collapsed before words did. You could see it, recognition crawling up his neck. The crowd murmured. The phones zoomed in. And somewhere deep in the courthouse security room, a red light blinked on the disabled camera feed. The clerk who'd filmed the glitch earlier grabbed her phone and ran for the chief's office, muttering, "You'll want to see this." Aaliyah saw her mother before anyone said a word. Relief and shame collided in her chest. She wanted to explain, to tell her she hadn't mouthed off, hadn't broken a rule, hadn't done anything wrong. But the look on Naomi Reed's face said she already knew. The judge's eyes swept the scene like a spotlight, landing on each badge, each name tag, each face that had decided to test her patience and her lineage in the same minute. "Officers," she said, voice steady, "is there a reason my child is being surrounded on government property?" No one answered. The tall officer cleared his throat, words fumbling. "Ma'am, we didn't realize." "You realized enough to stop her," Naomi cut in. "You realized enough to ignore protocol, to intimidate, and to forget that every inch of this plaza falls under my jurisdiction." The crowd stirred, phones tilted to catch every syllable. The tall one tried again. "There was a misunderstanding." "There always is," she replied. Her tone didn't rise, but the silence that followed felt like thunder. Inside, the chief of security stared at the footage on the clerk's phone, the camera feed blinking out exactly when the confrontation began, then flicking back on as Judge Reed arrived. 5 minutes gone, the clerk said. Every other feed clean. The chief cursed under his breath. "That's not a glitch. ... Somebody cut it." He looked up, realizing what that meant. Someone had known this incident would look bad before it even happened. He grabbed the radio, calling for the IT division, but word had already leaked. Courthouse employees were messaging each other, posting cryptic tweets about the gate, and by the time he stepped into the hall, reporters were already outside setting up tripods. Naomi Reed didn't bother with threats. She simply held out her hand toward her daughter. "Give me your folder, baby." Aaliyah passed it over, papers creased, one still bearing the officer's shoe print. Naomi turned it around, showing the smudge to the nearest camera. "This is what happens when authority forgets its purpose," she said. Her voice wasn't a shout, it was a verdict. The officer shifted, trying not to look cornered, but every lens caught the sweat beading on their temples. "Ma'am," one whispered, "if we'd known she was—" Naomi Reed cut him off. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The line hit the crowd like a flashbulb. People nodded, murmured. A woman in the back whispered, "Say that again," and someone else echoed it louder. The chant started small, awkward, but grew. Respect shouldn't need a name. And the plaza turned into a classroom for accountability. From a corner window above, a junior journalist from a local paper live-streamed the scene. The headline typed itself in her mind. "Judge Reed confronts officers after daughter targeted outside courthouse." Within minutes, the clip was bouncing across feeds. Comments poured in. They picked the wrong kid. This system only wakes up when it embarrasses itself. By the time Internal Affairs arrived, the story had already broken nationwide. Inside the chief's office, the phone rang non-stop. Reporters wanted statements, city officials wanted distance, and somewhere in the mayor's suite, an aide whispered, "Do we still have Judge Reed's endorsement?" The chief rubbed his forehead. "You don't lose a judge like that," he muttered. "You answer to her." Outside, Naomi Reed turned to the crowd. "Everyone who witnessed this," she said, "send your videos directly to my clerk's office. Do not delete them. Transparency saves us all." The way she said it sounded less like instruction and more like gospel. Even the officers listened, silent, as she gathered her daughter under one arm and walked her past the gate. Aaliyah held her head high. The cameras followed them, capturing the image that would headline the evening news: a mother and daughter walking side by side into the courthouse, sunlight glinting off the judge's robe, fear and pride sharing the same stride. Upstairs, the clerk handed the phone with the missing footage clip to an internal affairs agent. "Whoever killed that feed knew what they were doing," she said. "Find out who." The agent nodded. "We will." But everyone in that building knew investigations moved slow unless someone important pushed them. Naomi Reed wasn't just important, she was relentless. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse plaza was empty again, the heat rising off the stone like smoke after a fire. But the silence felt different now. Heavier. Waiting. The officers were back inside, being questioned one by one. Outside, the public kept watching their screens, replaying the moment the judge had said that line. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." It hit harder each time. Even people who didn't follow politics shared it because it sounded like something their grandmother might have said if she'd worn a robe and carried the Constitution in her pocket. That evening, as the sky turned gold behind the courthouse, Naomi Reed sat in her chambers, reviewing the preliminary report. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just looked tired, like someone who'd warned the world for years and had finally been proven right in the worst possible way. Aaliyah sat quietly across from her, tracing the edge of the folder. "You think they'll actually change?" she asked. Naomi looked up, eyes steady. "They will now," she said. "They just taught the whole country how justice really works." And somewhere outside, sirens passed down the avenue, still loud, still confident. But the people listening heard them differently than they had that morning. The story didn't explode all at once. It leaked like steam from a cracked pipe, until the pressure blew the whole courthouse wide open. By dawn the next day, the clip of Judge Reed confronting the officers had already climbed to the top of every social media feed in the country. Comment sections turned into courtrooms of their own. She warned them. They thought they could scare anybody. Imagine how many times this happens without a camera. The words scrolled faster than anyone could read. News vans camped outside the courthouse, satellite dishes blooming like metal flowers along the sidewalk. Reporters yelled questions into microphones as if volume could equal truth. The city's PR office tried to spin it, calling it a miscommunication, a training lapse, a regrettable misunderstanding. But every excuse fell apart when viewers replayed the officer's words. "Shut up, kid." The tone alone told the whole story. You didn't need subtitles for racism. You can hear it. Inside, panic wore suits. Department heads shuffled down corridors clutching folders like shields. Someone whispered that the district attorney wanted statements redrafted. Someone else said the mayor wanted distance. Emails flew, with subject lines like urgent, talking points, and request for narrative review. Yet every attempt at control felt outdated. Truth had already left the building and gone viral. Judge Reed sat in her chambers, reading the morning reports, expression unreadable. Her clerk asked, "Do you want to make a statement?" She answered, "Not yet. Let them dig their own hole first." Her calmness unnerved everyone. She knew exactly how systems collapse. Slow, procedural, and loud enough for history to record. Meanwhile, in the IT office, technicians uncovered that the 5-minute camera outage hadn't been random. A manual override had been triggered from a terminal registered to one of the senior officers, the same officer who supervised courthouse security, the same one who'd signed off on every disciplinary file Judge Reed had ruled against in the last 3 years. It wasn't just prejudice anymore. It was revenge. The clerk who found the data leak walked straight to Judge Reed's door, heart hammering. "Ma'am," she said, holding up the printout, "they deleted footage before it even happened." The judge took the page, scanned it once, and nodded. "Send copies to the Attorney General and the press." No hesitation, no meeting, no permission. That's how exposure works when someone with power decides to stop protecting appearances. By noon, the courthouse plaza looked like a protest and a press conference combined. Students held signs. "If justice is blind, why does she keep racial profiles?" And parents stood beside them, remembering every warning talk they'd given their kids about badges and tone. Reporters pressed against the barriers, shouting questions about corruption, oversight, accountability. The officers involved were suspended by evening, escorted out of the building through a side exit while cameras flashed like lightning. Their silence looked heavier than handcuffs. In living rooms across America, families watched the footage replay between commercials. The narrator's voice saying what everyone already felt. She was waiting for her mother outside the courthouse. Now, the courthouse is on trial. Behind closed doors, the police union representative demanded damage control. "We need to protect morale," he said. "Our people feel attacked." The mayor's advisor replied, "Your people attacked themselves on camera." No one laughed. For once, politics had lost its script. A special task force formed overnight, half law enforcement, half federal observers, to audit every courthouse security procedure in the state. Judge Reed refused to chair it. "You don't put the victim's family in charge of cleanup," she told the governor on a live call that reporters later leaked. The line went viral, too. By now, her every syllable had turned into a headline. In the courthouse cafeteria, younger officers sat in uneasy silence, avoiding eye contact with civilians who used to nod politely at them. You could taste the awkwardness. An entire culture suddenly aware of its reflection. One rookie whispered, "She's right, though. We do talk like that." Another said, "Not all of us." The first answered, "Enough of us." Conversations like that spread faster than memos ever could. That was the real exposure. People inside the system realizing they'd been part of the problem long before the cameras arrived. Judge Reed held her first press briefing 2 days later. She didn't hide behind podiums or prepared remarks. She stood on the courthouse steps, her daughter beside her, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder. "I've been told to wait for the investigation," she began. "But waiting is what lets injustice grow. We're not waiting anymore." She outlined a proposal for mandatory bias training certification and third-party oversight for every officer stationed at a court facility. A reporter shouted, "Is this personal?" She met his eyes. "Justice always is." The quote became the cover line for every major newspaper the next morning. That night, under bright city lights, graffiti appeared on the courthouse wall. "Respect shouldn't need a name." Maintenance crews painted over it by sunrise, but not before photos circled online, shared millions of times. What had started as humiliation now had a slogan, a movement, and a symbol. Somewhere in the noise, Aaliyah scrolled through the comments, half proud, half numb. The internet had turned her worst morning into a public crusade. She whispered to her mom, "Do you think they really care?" Naomi answered, "They do today. Our job is to make sure they still do tomorrow." Exposure doesn't end when the cameras turn off. It lingers in policy drafts, awkward meetings, and the quiet moments when people finally start thinking before they speak. By the end of that week, state representatives were calling for hearings. The police chief had resigned, and the mayor was on television, promising transparency. Everyone wanted to be part of reform now that the world was watching. But in the middle of all that noise stood Judge Reed and her daughter, two women who hadn't planned to start a revolution, but refused to be quiet when one found them. And from that day forward, whenever people passed the courthouse, they didn't just see columns and law. They saw a gate that reminded them what happens when silence meets truth under daylight. The city woke up angry. By sunrise, the courthouse steps looked like a press pit welded to a protest. Hand-painted signs waved in humid air. Justice for all, not just some. Respect shouldn't need a name. We saw the tape. Television anchors tried to narrate over the chants, their microphones trembling from the echo of 1,000 voices bouncing off marble walls. For the first time in years, the courthouse gate, the same one where Aaliyah had been cornered, was wrapped in flowers, posters, and candles instead of caution tape. Every network replayed Judge Reed's speech on loop. Talk show hosts quoted her like scripture. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The sentence had become a chant, a t-shirt, a tweet, a movement. Across town, coffee shops debated ethics, while teenagers printed the quote on stickers. Outrage had turned into a brand, but a righteous one, raw and untamed. Inside City Hall, the mood was panic wearing politeness. The mayor's staff drafted statements, crossed them out, redrafted. The police chief's phone buzzed non-stop with reporters asking about disciplinary action. "We can't rush due process," he said into every microphone, but his eyes told a different story, one of deadlines and fear. Every hour without a clear answer made the outrage burn hotter. On the courthouse's 22nd floor, Judge Reed met with the Attorney General behind a door that couldn't hold their voices. "This isn't a scandal," she said. "It's a symptom." The AG nodded, calculating optics more than morality. "We'll open hearings," he promised. "Make it public. People need to see we're in control." Naomi looked him dead in the eye. "Control isn't what they're asking for. They're asking for honesty." Downstairs, courthouse clerks watched the live stream on their phones instead of working. One whispered, "She's gonna burn them all down." Another replied, "Or rebuild it better." Everyone agreed on one thing. Nothing about their jobs would ever feel normal again. The officers involved had gone quiet. Their union lawyers spoke for them, tossing words like protocol and procedure into microphones, as if language could scrub away arrogance. But the public wasn't buying it. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag courthousegate. Hashtag Judge Reed. Hashtag shut up kid. Even late-night comedians turned the line into irony. Turns out the kid's mom doesn't shut up either, one joked. And the audience roared, half amusement, half admiration. In the Bureau of Internal Affairs, the mood was grim. Investigators spread files across tables, redacting names and unredacting guilt. The missing footage discovery had opened a trail, altered timestamps, erased logs, and one senior officer whose login appeared minutes before the feed cut. "You realize this ties straight to the precinct commander?" an agent muttered. "He's connected to half the city council." The lead investigator shrugged. "Then we start at the top." That line would never make headlines, but it was the first domino. Meanwhile, Aaliyah found herself living in a news cycle. She couldn't walk to class without microphones following, couldn't scroll her phone without seeing her face under captions she never wrote. Some called her brave, others called her lucky. She felt neither. At night, she replayed the moment the officer said, "Shut up, kid," and wondered how many other voices had been muted by fear before hers caught a microphone. Her mother kept reminding her, "You didn't ask for this, but you're handling it." Still, Aaliyah missed being invisible. By week's end, the governor announced a statewide review of courthouse security forces, naming Judge Reed as an independent advisor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, advising the same machine that had targeted her family. Reporters called it poetic justice. Naomi called it necessary work. She entered the new task force meeting with her daughter's photo tucked into a notebook, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. "This isn't about one mistake," she told the panel. "It's about every warning we ignored." Cameras caught the quote. It led the evening news. On the streets, protesters kept marching, but the tone had shifted from fury to focus. Law students handed out pamphlets on citizens' rights. Local artists painted murals of Aaliyah beside her mother, one hand raised, one hand holding a gavel. Drivers honked in support instead of frustration. Even a few off-duty officers joined, standing at the back of the crowd, heads low. It wasn't absolution, but it was a start. Inside the courthouse, Judge Reed's colleagues watched her with a mix of awe and discomfort. Some admired her composure, others feared her resolve. "She's turning this place into a spotlight," one whispered. "Good." And that was the new truth about outrage. It didn't just break things, it illuminated them. Meetings, once filled with jargon, now echoed with the question everyone avoided before. What would have happened if that camera hadn't been there? Silence answered every time. By the following Friday, the Justice Department had opened a federal review, citing patterns of bias in courthouse policing. It was bureaucratic language for revolution. Analysts on TV argued whether Judge Reed's rise would hurt her judicial neutrality. "Neutrality isn't silence," she told one interviewer live. "It's fairness applied equally, and equality requires confrontation." The clip trended instantly. That was her gift, turning restraint into power, outrage into architecture. That night, as rain returned to the city, Naomi and Aaliyah stood at the courthouse gate again. The flowers had wilted, but the signs remained. "You ready to go home?" Naomi asked. Her daughter nodded. "Yeah, just wanted to see it one more time." She looked at the brick wall where everything had started and whispered, "It doesn't feel the same." Her mother smiled softly. "It's not supposed to." They walked away together, camera lights flashing behind them, outrage slowly settling into legacy. The city wasn't healed yet, but it was listening, and that was more than anyone expected. Reckoning never arrives with fanfare. It slips in disguised as paperwork and hearings. The slow language of systems, forced to admit what everyone already knows. 3 weeks after the gate incident, the courthouse that once whispered Judge Reed's name now echoed it through loudspeakers. The state had convened a special hearing on bias in law enforcement, broadcast live on every major network. Rows of microphones glinted under fluorescent light, and a hush settled over the chamber as Naomi Reed took her seat at the center table. To her left sat federal observers. To her right, the city police chief who hadn't slept in days. Behind them, cameras blinked like nervous eyes. Everyone knew this wasn't just a hearing. It was judgment wearing a new suit. Outside, crowds gathered behind barricades, holding signs faded from rain and repetition. They weren't angry the way they had been. They were determined. You could hear it in their chants. Less shouting, more rhythm, like a heartbeat sinking the city to its conscience. Vendors sold coffee to protesters and journalists alike. Feels different this time, one said, like maybe they can't bury it. Inside, testimony began. Experts talked about statistics, lawyers about precedent, politicians about optics. Then the clerk called the first witness from the department. The tall officer, the one whose words had started it all, walked in, suit too tight, jaw set hard. Cameras zoomed. He read from a prepared statement about miscommunication and procedural confusion. The room felt colder with every euphemism. When Judge Reed's turn came to question him, she didn't raise her voice. "Sergeant," she said, "at what point did my daughter's existence become a threat to courthouse security?" He shifted, eyes flicking toward the cameras. "Ma'am, I was following protocol." "Protocol doesn't tell you to speak to minors that way," she replied. That tone wasn't policy. It was prejudice. Murmurs rippled through the room. The transcript of that exchange would later be quoted in ethics textbooks. Behind the glass partition, Aaliyah watched quietly. She hadn't wanted to come, but her mother insisted she see what accountability looked like. It wasn't satisfying. Not really. It was tedious and careful, of paper trails and polite confrontation. Yet in its slowness was power. Each documented truth chipped away at denial, and each pause forced the city to look in itself a little longer than comfort allowed. As the hearing stretched into its third hour, an aide slipped Naomi a folded note. Federal investigators confirmed tampering originated within courthouse security. 2 officers confessed. She read it once, tucked it under her binder, and spoke into the mic. "I have here new information proving this was not an isolated lapse, but a coordinated attempt to erase accountability." Gasps. The chairman of the hearing asked if she wished to submit evidence. She nodded. The screens behind her lit up with digital logs, timestamps, and access codes. The public watched live as the paper walls of bureaucracy tore themselves open. The chief lowered his head. "Madam Judge," he said, "will cooperate fully." Naomi answered simply, "I know, because now you have to." By evening, the hearing adjourned, but the story didn't rest. News anchors called it the day justice spoke back. Headlines read, "Data leak proves cover-up. Judge Reed forces confession from victim to vanguard." Talk shows debated whether she had crossed ethical lines by taking part in the investigation. Viewers didn't care. Public trust had chosen its side. At home that night, Aaliyah sat on the couch, watching the coverage replay. She looked at her mother, still in her work clothes, exhaustion written in posture rather than face. "You think this fixes it?" she asked. Naomi shook her head. "Nothing fixes it. It just exposes it enough that people have to stop pretending it isn't broken." She smiled faintly. "That's what reckoning really means." Across town, the police precinct held an emergency meeting. Younger officers spoke up for the first time, questioning old habits. The captain who once enforced silence resigned mid-sentence, realizing no one in the room wanted to defend him anymore. Policy drafts started forming, body cam audits, bias training renewals, oversight committees. It all sounded bureaucratic, but it was motion, and motion mattered. The next morning, the sun rose clean over Fulton County, washing gold over the courthouse facade. A janitor removing old protest posters paused at one tape to the gate. The words, smeared but legible, read, "Power is watching what you do when you think no one's recording." He left it there. Inside, Naomi arrived early, walking the same corridor that had once carried whispers about her temper. Now those whispers carried respect. She stopped by the clerk's desk, thanked her for keeping the footage, and said, "Courage isn't always loud, is it?" The clerk smiled. "No, ma'am. Sometimes it just hits record." By afternoon, federal agents announced indictments for evidence tampering and misconduct. The statement was brief, unemotional, but the subtext was thunder. Accountability had finally arrived. Cable news split screens. On one side, commentators analyzing implications. On the other, footage of Judge Reed leaving the courthouse, daughter by her side. The same gate behind them now guarded by silence instead of arrogance. Reckoning, it turned out, wasn't a single event. It was a rhythm, one that would echo through policy meetings, training sessions, and late-night conversations long after the headlines faded. But that week, for the first time in years, people in the city believed that change, real, inconvenient, irreversible change, might actually hold. And as Naomi closed her office door that evening, she whispered a small prayer, not of victory, but of endurance, that the truth they had dragged into daylight would never again be shoved back into the dark. Change never feels loud once the cameras leave. Weeks passed, and Fulton County slipped back into its routine. Case files stacked high, lawyers rushing through metal detectors, coffee carts humming outside the courthouse steps. But something under the noise had shifted. The same officers who once stood with folded arms at the gate now nodded to each visitor, voice even, eyes alert but not defensive. You could still feel tension, but it carried the quiet discipline of people aware that someone might always be watching. Accountability had become part of the atmosphere. Judge Naomi Reed moved through the halls differently too, less as an authority, more as a reminder. Every clerk straightened when she passed, not out of fear, but out of recognition that justice, for once, had worn a human face. On her office wall hung a single framed quote, printed on the back of an old protest sign. Respect shouldn't need a name. It wasn't decoration, it was doctrine. Across town, Aaliyah tried to rebuild normal. She returned to school, to scholarship essays, to the small rituals of being 17. The whispers followed her, some reverent, some jealous, but she carried herself the same way she had the day before the world learned her name. In interviews, she kept her words simple. "I just wanted to wait for my mom," she told reporters, and somehow that sentence carried more weight than any speech. At night, she scrolled through messages from strangers, teachers, veterans, kids from neighborhoods like hers, all saying the same thing. "I saw myself in you." It scared her at first, the responsibility that came with visibility. But her mother told her visibility was power, and power demanded grace. The city council eventually passed the Courthouse Protection and Accountability Act, mandating independent civilian monitors and public access to disciplinary records. Local headlines called it the Reed Reform. The mayor signed it in the same courtyard where the first confrontation had happened, handing the pen to Aaliyah. Cameras clicked, but this time the flash felt celebratory, not exploitative. "History doesn't fix pain," Naomi said quietly into the microphones, "but it can keep others from repeating it." The applause that followed was polite, but the meaning was permanent. Elsewhere, people still argued. Some said she'd gone too far, blurred the line between judge and activist. Others said she'd done what every decent human should. The debate itself was proof that complacency had been shaken. Late-night pundits still dissected the case. Scholars cited it in lectures, and students wrote essays titled "When Justice Spoke Back." The world had moved on, yet echoes remained. Echoes in how officers greeted citizens, in how citizens questioned authority, in how silence had lost its comfort. One morning, months later, Naomi stood by her office window, watching the plaza below. Workers were setting up a bronze plaque near the gate. The inscription read, "In memory of every voice silenced by authority and every truth that refused to stay quiet." She didn't request it, the community had. She smiled faintly, then turned as Aaliyah walked in carrying college brochures. "California or DC?" her daughter asked. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Whichever one keeps you loud." They laughed, softly, the way survivors do when life finally lets them breathe. That evening, the courthouse lights glowed warm against the dusk. A passing tourist asked a guard what had happened there months ago. The guard, a new recruit barely out of training, replied, "That's where respect learned its lesson." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Stories like that live longer than explanations. In the months that followed, other cities called Judge Reed for advice. Panels, conferences, think tank meetings. Everyone wanted to know how she turned outrage into reform without letting it dissolve into vengeance. Her answer never changed. By remembering it was never about power, it was about principle. That line became the quiet anthem of a movement that refused to die with the news cycle. On the anniversary of the incident, the courthouse plaza filled again, not with protest, but with music. Local choirs sang spirituals, school children read essays about equality, and someone projected footage of the first press briefing onto the courthouse wall. The crowd cheered when the old clip showed Naomi saying, "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." This time, instead of anger, the air carried pride. The past had not vanished, but it had evolved into purpose. As night settled, Naomi and Aaliyah stood at the same gate under string lights hung by volunteers. Aaliyah looked around and whispered, "It feels lighter." Her mother nodded. That's what justice should feel like. They stayed a moment longer, letting the hum of the crowd fade into the city's heartbeat. No grand speeches, no final verdicts, just two people, one truth, and a place that finally understood what its name meant. And that was the real ending. Not the press conferences, not the hearings, but the quiet realization that the fight against prejudice doesn't end with punishment. It begins with recognition. The courthouse would keep running, cases would keep coming, but somewhere in every sworn officer's mind lived a memory of a rainy morning, a careless phrase, and the woman who turned that moment into a mirror. Reckoning had passed, reflection remained, and under the glow of those courthouse lights, justice, tired, scarred, but breathing, stood a little taller.